LLMs are going to advance in their capabilities, but they're still not human. They're not going to have all of the context and nuance that a human being has from just being human. And so there are things that human care will always be primarily more preferred for a number of reasons. But I think that humanity is really at the core of that.
Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of Beyond the Couch, AI in Psychology. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. So as always, before we get started, I always want to take a moment to thank the organizations that make this podcast possible. This episode is sponsored by the American Board of Professional Psychology, the National Register of Health Service Psychologists, and my consulting firm, Wayde AI. Their support helps us create thoughtful, psychology-focused conversations about how AI is shaping our field. My guest today is Dr. Alyssa Dietz, a clinical psychologist with a background spanning academia, clinical practice, and digital health. Her work has focused on using technology to expand access to high-quality, evidence-based mental health care, including the development and evaluation of digital interventions and AI-supported tools. She currently leads clinical work at IESO, where she focuses on clinical strategy, evaluation, and evidence generation for technology-enabled mental health care. Alyssa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you about you and your work, but before we get started, I always like to start by asking, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and the journey that led you to AI, including the experiences that really shaped your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great way to get this started. So, as you mentioned, I am a clinical psychologist by background, and I started way back in my PhD work looking at how we could leverage digital technology to facilitate access to high quality care. At the time, I was more focused on prevention and early intervention, but I've sort of worked along the full continuum since then. And so that's sort of where I got bit by this bug of like technology can help, right? And so I graduated with my PhD. I went on to be a tenure track professor. I was teaching, training future therapists, directing a research lab, looking at how we could leverage technology to improve quality of life for people, specifically around behavioral and mental health. And frankly, Ernest, I got frustrated. Like the vast majority of people who need mental health care in the US get nothing. And when they do get something, it's rarely consistent with evidence based practice. And I was just convinced that technology could help solve that problem, right? And so I left to work at a company that's called Therapeutics. This was about 8 years ago now. And they were trying to commercialize a prescription digital therapeutic, the first of its kind, it's considered a software as medical device. To address substance use disorder and opioid use disorder. And so the long story short there is that ultimately Pear was not successful and ended up going bankrupt, but I learned some really valuable lessons that stuck with me. And part of it was that you know, access is a major problem for so many people, especially in the US, and that the technology can produce outcomes that are comparable to human delivered outcomes in many circumstances, or can help to achieve those outcomes faster and in a more scalable way than maybe able to do with just humans alone. And so I went to a company that was called Happify at the time, and it was sort of a similar idea where there were digital intervention products around mental health and behavioral health, and also some chronic condition care, and specifically how mental health interacts with chronic conditions. And that was my first exposure to working on AI. So we had a rules based chatbot that would deliver some of the cognitive and behavioral skills training, or in some cases, it would like facilitate questionnaire completion. And those were the early days. It was clunky and stilted, but again, I couldn't stop thinking about this multiplier that we could potentially leverage to improve access to high quality support. And so that brings me to my role now. I am head of clinical at IESO. IESO has a long heritage of delivering mental health care, specifically in the UK, actually. It was typed psychotherapy before we all had bandwidth on our phones to support telehealth as we think about it today. And we've got this massive data set that's linked to outcomes that we're able to use to understand, patterns of behavior, what's effective under what circumstances. And from that, we've built a suite of AI products and services, all in service of this idea of, can we help more people get the mental health support that they need?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that journey. I love the story of how you've moved through this. And I love that you have experience in the clinical world, in the academic world, and in industry. I think that's really
Mhm.
very helpful. I want to ask you about some of the work that you've seen in the development through technology and AI. Specifically, I'm thinking about as AI becomes, more empathetic or uses more clinical, appropriate language. What do you think still distinguishes a useful response from genuinely human therapeutic understanding?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think at the end of the day, LLMs are going to advance in their capabilities, but they're still not human. They're not going to have all of the context and nuance that a human being has, from just being human. And so there are things that I think, human care will always be primarily for, or maybe more preferred for a number of reasons. But I think that humanity is really at the core of that.
Yeah, I love that answer, and I think one of the things that you've also mentioned that I think is really important that really fits in there is safety, right? You've talked about
Mhm.
safety being really important. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see safety, especially as you're incorporating technology into mental health? How do you position yourself to make sure that you're remaining safe?
It's a great question. It's something we think about all the time, and there are layers to this, right? So there are safety risks from the perspective of, like, is somebody going to put off getting, a higher level of care because they think that they're able to be their needs met by, like, a conversational agent or another AI tool. So we think about it from that perspective. We also think about what the AI is doing and delivering. So, um, there are the overt things, the things we've read about in the news headlines, the really upsetting stories about encouraging self-harm, etc. But there's also much more subtle layers of safety, right? Like, what about, reinforcing delusions? What about, replacing or amplifying avoidance and escape behavior? Now it's the escape behaviors using a chatbot. There are also these subtle layers of safety that we have to be super aware of as well. And so I think a lot about responsible innovation and how we do that. And, I spend a lot of time thinking about what are the potential harms that could come. And then I think about how confident are we in this signal, that this signal is, representative of a real harm to a user. And then I think about the severity and the scope, and then what you would do to escalate or mitigate. And so I use that framework to organize my thinking in designing tests to see, is what we're releasing safe? Is it appropriate to release? And then we also continue those tests after deployment to make sure things like the model has not drifted, or there's been leakage from prompts or something along those lines. So it's a constant process. It's multi-layered. It's not just like this checkbox that you hit and then you're done. It needs to be something that's thought about constantly.
Yeah, I really appreciate that very intricate evolution, right? And it's a process as you talk about with safety. Can you
Mhm.
give us some practical examples of how ISO handles safety and some of the challenges that you found when trying to make sure that the product remains safe?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is super interesting is that early on, um, you know, we were really concerned about, like, suicidal related safety, self-harm related safety. And so we'd built a system, a classifier that would detect when language of self-harm was detected. And it would also look at things like, hopelessness, which we know from the research literature is a predictor, right, of self-harm. And what we found is it was too sensitive. So I can give an example. Someone said something along the lines of, like, "Oh, I tried surfing yesterday. I was hopeless at it." And then the conversational agent sort of jumps in like, "Oh, wait, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And here's how you need to reach out to crisis support, etc." Which, like, yeah, the system was doing what it was designed to do, but then it was so disruptive and so much friction that people were disengaging prematurely. And so trying to figure out how to iterate and like titrate the dials to get to just the right level is a real challenge. And so today, if you said, I tried surfing yesterday, I was hopeless at it, you're not going to get that response of like, oh, you've said something that I'm concerned about your safety. Can you confirm, blah, blah, blah? Here's crisis resources. So now it's more tuned where it won't do that. But my point is, it took a lot of thinking, a lot of evaluation, a lot of experimentation, which are all skills that come naturally to psychologists because of our training, in order to hone that in, to have that tension as balanced as possible between a good experience for the user and something that is safe and appropriate for them too.
Yeah, I love that example. It reminds me of a news story we read recently about how some of the big AI organizations were really trying to make sure that the models were more and more safe, and so they were overreacting to these cues and engaging in mental health processes that were not appropriate, right? So I think, as you said,
Hmm.
this is where psychologists can be really helpful. But as you're talking about that, I'm also thinking about how it would be really helpful to have a tool, an application that can help you identify some of those things. So how can psychologists start to think about how they can start incorporating AI into their workflow and their daily work?
Yeah, I think things like AI scribes are becoming more commonplace. Obviously, we want to make sure before we use something like that in our practice that they are, we are transparent in where the data goes. We get consent from our patients. All of those things absolutely apply. But one of the things that's really interesting about AI is that it's able to pattern match and it's able to hold a reference window beyond what any human brain can comprehend, right? And so we can start to look for subtleties. We can look for new ways of predicting risk related behavior. And we can also start to look at what interventions are helpful and then being able to surface those insights to psychologists that they're able to have that greater level of insight into their patients and what might be helpful for them.
Yeah, I love that example. I know at IESO, you guys work specifically with AI providing CBT skills training, right? What are some of that work giving you insight into what AI does well and where perhaps it might not be appropriate in the clinical
Yeah.
psychiatry?
One of the things that it does not do well yet, I'm not saying it will never do well, but today, the clinical judgment piece is not where it would be considered comparable to a human psychologist, right? And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Where I think it does really well is skills training, teaching people a new concept, helping them figure out a practice schedule and a practice plan that makes sense for them and their life and their specific circumstances. And so I think about this a lot. Like when I used to be a professor, this was over a decade ago now, the flipped classroom model was all the rage. It was like if you give somebody your class something to work on at home or to learn the concept and they come into the classroom and you deepen, you help them sort of troubleshoot, right? So I think about AI sometimes like that. Like I remember there were days when I was seeing patients like in the VA maybe, and I would have had maybe like 8 first behavioral activation sessions in a week. So that's like 8 hours of basically saying more or less the same thing, right? Like introducing the concept, behavioral activation, et cetera. So what I think about is that like the AI is able to teach that concept, teach that skill, help build a practice plan. And then a human can be there to help with that judgment, to deepen the specifics, figure out how to amend their plan because they're on shift work or, whatever it might be, but really deepen the applicability of the concepts to the person and help navigate complexities that we know are the rule rather than exception in human reality and behavior.
Yeah, I think, okay, so let's follow that thread a little bit, right? So
Mhm.
what would that look like if, let's say, AI takes more and more of that skills training function, right? How might that
Mhm.
change therapist's role over time?
Yeah, and I think ultimately it will. That said, there's going to need to be changes in things like incentives, billing modes, things of that nature. But I can envision a world where AI is doing the skills training, and there's psychologists who are supervising that, right? And so I mean that in a couple of different ways. There's supervising the technology. So, for example, where I work today, we have post deployment evaluations that flag things that are drift or problematic. For example, it's not supposed to give diagnosis, it's not supposed to give advice. So, if it were to do that, that gets flagged and surfaced to a human so that there can be an appropriate follow up instance. But I also think about psychologist supervision, about supervising the care of the patients. And so, one person could theoretically be doing both of those things, or maybe they're separate roles. But a human being can be there to deepen, to add insights, to specify. Ernest and I have been working on cognitive diffusion in this week's practice. Make sure you emphasize that practice skill, and then the conversational agent is able to carry that through at 2 a.m. when the psychologist isn't available. Um, so I think there are a number of ways, and then there's also like escalation support, like crisis support, right? So if we see that someone is getting some basic skills training and practice through AI, but that's not helping, then escalating them to a human psychologist. And so I see a psychologist maintaining the supervisory role, and they're still intervening, they're still interacting, but the day-to-day split of time looks different than it might today.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially as we're thinking in the future as to what it might look like, right? And part of that, as
Mhm.
you described, psychologists might play that oversight role, right? That more management role. What do you think responsible oversight looks like for someone who is using psychology AI in their psychological practice? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to how the systems are designed and making sure that they're calibrated to be flagging the right thing. So, for example, today, my team receives a flag if somebody sets off our risk detector, so harm to self, harm to others, et cetera, those kinds of things. But you could also do things like watch PHQ and GAD score tracking. And if there's a certain level of deterioration, being able to intervene about that. If you see that a certain intervention isn't landing, being able to send your patient a message and be like, hey, I just want to clarify this concept that seems like it was a little bit confusing. So I think that the AI tools can help surface where the psychologist needs to interact, but it's really important that those tools are calibrated appropriately and that they're usable so that when the psychologist is getting a signal, it's a true signal and not getting buried in a bunch of noise. So we have to be really thoughtful about how we design those monitoring systems as well.
Yeah, so let's I'm gonna ask you a little bit about how a psychologist can play a role in designing some of these applications and tools, right? So what do you
Yeah.
see as the value that a psychologist can bring to that development setting?
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics. Yeah, so there are a number of opportunities for psychologists. Obviously, psychologists are my people. I'm a psychologist, so I think highly of us, but we have a really diverse skill set, right? Like we understand research and program evaluation. We understand assessment. We understand psychometrics. We understand clinical interactions and clinical service delivery. We understand how people think. We understand how people learn. We understand motivation. There are all these concepts that are super relevant to these AI companies and the products that they're building. And so, some of the ways that I have been involved, it's been from several different angles. So, psychologists with different skill sets or different emphases could still be involved. So, from the beginning, like specifying what are we building, what is ethical, what is appropriate, what is going to result in doing good for people who are seeking out these tools, as opposed to what could inadvertently cause harm. There is designing evaluation systems. So I do a lot of this in my day-to-day work. So understanding what are the harms that could be realized via using this product or system, defining what that looks like, defining how to measure it, measuring it, iterating on it so that you're reducing or eliminating that harm, and then being able to track that post deployment to make sure that things are staying where they need to be in terms of model adherence, drift, etc. But psychologists for better or for worse, we think a lot about harms that befall people, right? Some of them are very overt, like the example I gave before about suicidality, and some of them are much more subtle. And so psychologists bring a really valuable lens to that like breadth of human experience and are able to articulate and foresee what many of these issues could be and then develop the yardsticks that we're measuring by to make sure that these systems are being designed and implemented safely. Then there's the research side, right? Can we validate that this thing is safe and effective and does the things that it's meant to do, it's designed to do? Psychologists obviously have a role there. And then we could look at program evaluation. When this is deployed in a service, does it improve outcomes? Does it improve cost? Does it improve speed to care? There's all kinds of ways that we can apply that. And then all the way down to like behavioral design, right? Like so from, behavioral science, like how do we get people to use this enough that it's beneficial, but not so much that they become entangled and become sort of like an addictive cycle. So there are so many places for psychologists to get involved. And I just think our skill sets really uniquely position us to deliver a lot of value in the development of this technology.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think you've made some really great points there. And I'm always trying to encourage psychologists to get involved, right? I think this is exactly where we can be helpful and very useful. Now, I want to ask you because you've been in the industry, in the technology industry for a while. What have you learned, or what have you experienced that you think would benefit psychologists to know about, what it's like to work in that sort of space?
Yeah, the steepest part of the learning curve was understanding the specifics of business, how money flows, commercial realities, and what that means. I mean, I want to believe that on an individual level, individuals care about doing what's best for people, specifically vulnerable populations who are looking for support or that need that special care. And we're working with businesses, right? And if they don't make money, there's not going to be any distribution. There's not going to be any reaching of the people who need this extra support. And so that was definitely the steepest learning curve for me is to understand how the money flows, how incentives align. And that is probably, that's probably the most impactful thing that I have learned since transitioning into industry is like how to
That
think
part,
about a business.
what
Yeah.
should we know? Tell us more a little bit about how we should understand healthcare incentives and how that impacts the development and availability of these tools and applications.
Yeah, so we need to think about like who are you selling to? What problems are they trying to solve? Are they trying to solve retention and engagement? Are they trying to drive up outcomes? Are they trying to, solve something else entirely? Because then what you position to them needs to solve that problem. And so, when I first sort of naively transitioned in, I was like, well, it's better outcomes. Like, of course, like, why wouldn't they want that? And then it's like, well, this business makes money based on having sessions occur. And so if fewer sessions occur, that's then undercutting their business. So they either need to make it up on volume or they need to make it up on margin. So it was just like trying to understand how a business makes money and the problems they're trying to solve and how what I was building either helps them solve those problems or actually makes them worse in some way. And so, it is helpful because it shapes what you build, because the problems that it solves need to be aligned to what the businesses in that category are trying to do. So, for example, a health plan might have different incentives. They're trying to restrict overall cost of care, they want to limit that. They might have different incentives than, say, a provider platform, which wants to keep people engaged and to a successful outcome. And so they'd rather it take as many sessions as it takes to get to that successful outcome, right? Whereas a health plan's more concerned about how can we minimize spend or where does it reduce spend, et cetera. So it's just learning how to consider what you're offering from those different lenses and who your customer is and the problems that they're trying to solve.
Yeah, I think that's such a really helpful insight that you're able to bring, especially because you've worked in a lot of those different industries. I think that's really helpful for psychologists to understand that, right? So we're talking a little bit more about literacy, right? So when we're talking about literacy, usually I'm talking about AI literacy, but what you're also talking about is that business acumen, the business literacy,
Mhm.
right? How do you suggest that psychologists try to get some of this understanding and knowledge?
Yeah, it's a really tough problem. Like, I don't know about you, but I received no business training in my, 7 years of a PhD. And so I do think I have seen increasing calls in training programs, like especially if people are going to do things like go into private practice, it is helpful for them to have a business context, right? And then I would also say there are conferences that would be useful to gain exposure to. There's one in particular I like that I'm going to shout out. It's called Behavioral Health Tech. And that is one where there are behavioral health leaders in the room and there are business leaders in the room, and they're talking about, the tensions and the trade-offs. And I think going to something like that, if you're able to do that, is really helpful in widening our understanding of the systems and how things interplay with one another. There are also great resource groups. One that I'm a part of is called Therapists in Tech. And so we'll regularly talk about business issues, or there will be, special sessions where people are educating on a specific topic. So there are a number of like professional organizations that are doing that sort of ad hoc business training, if you will, or exposure to business principles, but within a behavioral health context that I think could be super helpful for psychologists that are working in the behavioral health space.
Yeah, those are great resources. Thanks for sharing those. I want to ask you a little bit about your experience when you first came into the industry, right? What was that like, and how has that changed over time in terms of how you were received and perceived as you worked with your team?
Yeah. So I started in a role that was called medical science liaison, which is more common in pharma than it is in tech, especially today. That's definitely true. But it was the perfect segue because a medical science liaison is taxed with um, education, both internal and external. So, a software engineer starts and has never heard of cognitive behavior therapy before. You're the resource that teaches them and orients them to this idea of here's what we're trying to build. And then you also educate the market. So that includes they talk about like key opinion leaders, there, which typically, not always, but are typically researchers or other clinical influencers, people who write clinical guidelines, documentation that are on important committees, et cetera. And then also educating like health plans on this is a new technology or this is a new intervention and here's how it works and here's how it can save you money. And my role during that time was really to be the expert on the clinical theory and the evidence that had been generated to date, which is such a nice natural segue. And then the other thing that you do is that you translate that clinical theory or that research theory or that research evidence, I should say, to meet different stakeholders' needs. So sometimes you're talking to another scientist and you're going to talk about it a lot differently than if you're talking to a room full of practitioners, maybe, right? And so learning how to calibrate and change how you talk about these complex concepts was a great skill. And I think it was a very easy entrance for me because also my research background had been in substance use. I was doing this in substance use disorders. And so that was a great way in. And then from there, I was able to absorb as much as I could. I'd go to market meetings to learn like how are they selling this? Who are they selling it to? I'd go to marketing meetings. I'd try to be a fly on a wall wherever I could to absorb as much of that business context as I was able to do. And then ultimately, I moved into a role where it was a bit more of that commercial focus. So, yeah, I was still doing the clinical and research stuff, but it was through more of a commercial lens. And essentially, I was helping to sell digital therapeutic products to health plans, to employers, to pharma companies. And so it was really beneficial to have that exposure to the business side of things there. And because of my expertise, and I could say I was a licensed clinical psychologist, it lended a credibility and an expertise that folks weren't able to achieve, without those credentials. And so that was also very warmly received. So, sometimes we have to work a little harder to get that credibility and being embraced, also educating yourself about AI and being able to use basic terminology around AI is something I'd recommend too, in order to increase that receptibility to people trying to make that transition.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really important to kind of hear about the experience and the journey, right? That people could
Mhm.
take multiple journeys,
Yeah.
but hearing about your journeys That's really interesting. So talking about
Yeah.
the credibility and
Yeah.
the impact that you're able to have as a psychologist, it's
Mhm.
not just about, it's about what you can do with that, right? And why you should be
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah. So there are a number of ways that I'm able to bring that credibility. One is in the sales conversations, right? So a lot of the products that are emerging in this AI race, I kind of joke that they're like two dudes in a garage in Silicon Valley. And I hope to differentiate that, right? That like there's been clinical consideration baked in from the beginning. Like every prompt has been reviewed and signed off by a clinician. The evaluation and safety systems are signed off by clinicians before things are released. And so adding that legitimacy and that credibility, 'cause frankly, I think it's the right thing to do, but doing that, demonstrating that is helpful in sales conversations. So I do a lot of that. Another place where I think about it quite a bit about the credibility impact is in terms of our evidence generation strategy. So I oversee that as well. So being able to collect evidence and frankly, I'd expand what I thought about as evidence, as a psychologists, like a double blind RCT is sort of the gold standard. That's where your mind goes first, right? But expanding my view of what evidence is. And for example, the evaluation systems I mentioned before, where we're running simulations and we're, flagging behaviors that are deviated from our expected or required behavior. Like, I mean, that's evidence. There's thousands of utterances that have been evaluated, and there's a threshold that needed to be passed. And so thinking about how you generate evidence, how you collect that evidence, and then present it to your buyers, payers, et cetera, so that they feel satisfied that what you're doing is something that is going to move the needle and have impact on people.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially where you're talking about looking at data and evidence different than how we might, in the psychological realm. And so expanding
Yeah.
your viewpoint, right? I think that's really
Yeah.
awesome. And I know ISO has a lot of data. Talk to us a little bit about how ISO specifically leverages the data that you collect.
Yeah, we do it. We do it in a number of ways. So we've mostly talked about sort of the user-facing tools that AISO has today, and one of the things that we've done there is we're able to look at patterns, what worked for who under what circumstances, and based on that, able to select skills and sequence the skills in order to match like what the person is looking for. So they'll talk about their preferences, their stated goals, those kinds of things. Then we're able to look at, well, these types of skills tend to work better for this phenotype versus these types of skills work better for this phenotype. And so we've been able to build that into our program. And we also have clinician facing tools that we use as well. And so those are also based on the data, but we're able to look at things like dropout prediction and intervening around that. We are able to look at things like predicted symptom trajectory and how a person is tracking against that in order to inform the clinician. Like, they may want to make a decision about that insight. They may want to change course, or they may want to make sure that they watch their talking to client talking ratio in their next session to try to improve engagement and retention. And so we're able to surface insights from our data to a clinician that they may take into consideration when they're deciding what to do next with their patients.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Alyssa, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for coming on. This is really interesting. I really appreciate you sharing this with us.
Likewise, it was great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And so I would like to ask, how do people contact you if they want to continue the conversation or they've got questions for you? What's a good way to reach out?
Yeah, I think the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So again, my name is Alyssa Dietz. You can search me up and find me on LinkedIn. Send me a connection. I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. And before I let you go, I always like to ask our experts, what's a tip or recommendation that you can leave us with?
A tip or recommendation that I will leave you with is never stop learning. And I think for psychologists, like that's a little bit of our like natural default position. But there have been so many twists and turns in my career that I never would have predicted, right? Like I went to get a PhD because I wanted to be a professor, and that's what I thought I was going to spend my life doing. And here I am, 10, 15 years later. And I never could have foreseen this. So just being open to the opportunities, open to learning about technology and business and all sorts of things that are, they touch our expertise, but they're not things that we have maybe direct exposure to. So keep learning, stay open, and come along for this wild ride because you might surprise yourself. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that. That's such great advice, especially because the reality is AI is here. Technology is a part of all of our lives. And so I think you're
Yeah.
cutting edge of it. I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Awesome. And to everybody else, if you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. Feedback is a gift, and we love gifts. So we hope you'll join us again next time.